Toby, you've known Boris Johnson for years. You backed him to become Prime Minister, and you now think you made a mistake.
Yes, I've come to this decision with some regret, Dan. I fought in Boris's corner for a long time, have always defended him, always maintained he'd make a great leader of the Conservative Party. Once placed a bet with Nigella Lawson after a boozy dinner in which she said, it's absurd for Boris to go into politics. He'll never amount to anything. And I said, on the contrary, he'll be leader of the party one day. And she said, care to make it interesting? And we bet 15 grand that he would one day be leader of the Conservative Party. And it's slightly unclear as to what the timeline was, so neither of us has tried to collect from the other. But I was nonetheless...
So Nigella owes you 15 grand?
Well, she may claim that the timeline of the bet expired because it was within the next 15 years, and I think he was just outside that envelope when he had. But anyway, I've always been a huge booster of Boris's. I wrote a 5,000-word hagiographic piece in Quillette, this Australian online magazine I'm the London-based editor of, lauding Boris, saying, the hour has come, cometh the hour, cometh the man. He is the man to steer Britain into the kind of post-Brexit promised land. I couldn't have been more enthusiastic. So it is with enormous regret that I've come to this conclusion. But I do think that he has mishandled the response to the coronavirus crisis so badly. And whilst in part, I think you have to cut him some slack because he did come down with such a bad bout of
Nearly
COVID.
died, Toby. He nearly died.
Nearly died. And clearly he hasn't completely recovered and still isn't quite himself. But I think to attribute his failings to that alone, I think, is in some ways to let people like me off the hook because, the rot set in before he got ill. It wasn't as if he really applied himself to this crisis when he saw it coming towards us, as it clearly was in January and February. And in March, when he initially seemed to embrace a herd immunity strategy and talked about taking it on the chin, I was incredibly proud. I was thinking, that's the Boris I voted for. Let's not toss our hard-won liberties out of the window by overreacting to a pandemic we don't really understand yet. We don't know how deadly it is. We don't know how virulent it is. Let's not overreact. Let's not suspend the right of habeas corpus, imprison people in their homes like they're doing in China, in Italy. Let's be a lot more cautious and modest. Let's suggest more modest social distancing measures, but let's make it voluntary. Let's not get all authoritarian and Cromwellian. When that was his response, I thought, fantastic. That's the guy I voted for. Well done, Boris. Bit of British exceptionalism. Brilliant. And then suddenly there was this panic-induced U-turn, and on March 23rd, it was into lockdown, one of the more severe lockdowns. Liberties suspended up and down, economy crashed. To hell with the public health consequences. Let's suspend cancer screening programs. Let's suspend elective surgeries, outpatient care. Disastrous policies which have had calamitous consequences. And,
But it sounds like, Toby, you would accept it first time around. But now, here we are, death rates are still low, and we're talking about 10 p.m. curfews. We're talking about mingling in the street being illegal, and it's too much for you now.
It's too much for me. I think if he'd have course-corrected, if he'd have said, when he recovered in May and June, if he'd said, folks, we overreacted. We shouldn't have closed schools. We shouldn't have turned the NHS into a COVID-only service. We shouldn't have mothballed the economy. It was a mistake. We overreacted. Forgive us. We didn't know just how dangerous this virus was. Now we know that it's much less dangerous than we thought. We're going to correct. So it looks like Sweden have got it right. We're now going to follow in their footsteps. Had he done that, had he adjusted instead of doubling down. You know, it was supposed to be a 3-week lockdown, not a 6-month lockdown. And now they're talking about a second lockdown. You know, schools have only gone back. Kids are about to be sent home again. Is the NHS going to become a COVID-only service for the entirety of the winter? It's as though having made this colossal error, probably the biggest policy error in the history of peacetime, they're about to repeat it all over again. Anything but admit they were wrong. And, you know, that isn't the guy I voted for. When I heard him talking, as you quoted, about COVID marshals, you know, Boris is a libertarian. Boris is this great Rabelaisian, Falstaffian figure. He's a seaside postcard come to life. He's not someone who wants to turn Britain into a nation of curtain-twitching Stasi wannabes. You know, where's that guy gone? It's like he's been captured by the body snatchers. You know, I want the guy I voted for back, please. You know, the guy you've got up there now, he's not fooling me. That's not the guy. That's somebody else.
How much blame, though, can we cast at the door of Chris Whitty, who seems to be absolutely determined to send this country back into lockdown? Or does Boris need to actually stand up to Whitty and potentially even sack him, Toby, and say, look, if you can't come up with another strategy, I want a new chief medical officer?
Well, I think, Dan, it's tempting to blame the most influential members of SAGE, these public health panjandrums who think the solution to every crisis is to have these massive liberty-infringing state interventions that bankrupt the economy. But if you look at the meetings, the minutes of the SAGE meetings in the week leading up to lockdown, March 23rd,
yes,
there was no consensus on SAGE that this was the right policy. The advice from SAGE was, well, you've introduced some modest social distancing measures on March 16th. You've encouraged people who've got the disease to quarantine. You've recommended the shielding of the elderly and the vulnerable. You banned mass gatherings. You haven't closed schools yet. You haven't imprisoned everyone in their home. The advice from SAGE at that point was, let's give this a few weeks and see if it's enough to bring the R rate below 1. It wasn't to lock down. And I think actually people like Chris Whitty were quite surprised when on March 23rd, suddenly the decision came down from on high that we were going to impose this really severe full Monty lockdown. So, tempting though it might be to blame this coterie of overcautious, authoritarian public health scientists, I don't think you can. I think it was ultimately a political decision, and I think their advice is downstream of the political decisions coming out of Downing Street. So ultimately, I think it's on Boris.
Well, it's a rip-roaring column. Toby Young in today's Spectator magazine. I admit it, I was wrong to back Boris. Toby, thank you so much for your company.